Hi everyone. Today we're going to be reading an updated version of The Wolf is Loose, honoring Renee Good by fighting back. As far as that goes, essentially I took the original write-up, which was basically a public service announcement, and I turned it into a full-fledged essay. This essay includes a lot of different points of view, not just white ones, and it tries to go beyond Renee Good and think about the larger issues at play, more so than I did originally, that is. Without further ado, let's get started. Also, before we get started, we'll only be reading part of the essay. I'll be explaining which parts when we get to the table of contents. For now, we'll be reading the opening, then the table of contents. We'll explain what parts we'll be reading after that. We'll read those, and we'll conclude things at the end. We also won't be looking at footnotes, save for the initial number 1 footnote. There will be other footnotes as well. If you want to read those, you can do so yourselves. The Wolf is Loose, honoring Renee Good by fighting back. January 8th, 2026. ICE agents in Minneapolis murdered Renee Good yesterday, shooting her after asking her to leave the vicinity of an ongoing ICE raid. Renee was recording said raid well within her rights to do so. She died next to her wife, sitting in the passenger seat as the ICE agent fired unprompted into their car. He did so, a masked gunman, armed and armored versus an unarmed woman, as Renee drove away from the officers, i.e. when she complied. She followed their order to leave and they killed her anyways, effectively martyring her, a concept we'll touch on sporadically throughout, but mainly in the preface and the footnotes. Correction, her wife was recording ICE. Renee was effectively a bystander without a camera. Such is fascism in action, state corruption, a feature of capital, not a bug, hammering any who dare speak out once decay routinely sets in. Cops killing witnesses, whistleblowers, and activists by design. The Wolf is Loose fights back, exploring the fascist ramifications to honor Good and others like her by revealing the state rot she exposed in death, if not on purpose, while touching conversationally on historical and poetic examples, side by side, as the Gothic does, Gothic communism being a holistic intersectional discipline. In doing so, it examines state vampirism through a werewolf critical lens, with lycanthropy and vampirism being poetically similar out of the Renaissance, generally as markers of disease and criminal activity for playwrights to abject, e.g. Count Ferdinand in John Webster's The Duchess of Malfi. Update. The shooter has since been identified as Jonathan Ross, a 10-year ICE veteran. Also, Good's wife was actually outside their car when Ross approached Good, Good's wife entering the car as Ross fired into it, killing Good. Such men as fascism demands view themselves as superior to other races, but white women too. In-group police, cleansing a given kingdom of degenerate out-group members or those cast into the out-group's state of exception, while enjoying various hypocritical standards themselves, e.g. clearly non-white brides, below. Table of contents. Note, I've expanded The Wolf is Loose greatly since first publishing it, table of contents included, and while I've made numerous changes throughout, the clear and obvious addendums are in bold and color-coded. Same goes for various keywords I've previously coined, usually only once, while stressing their keyword status, e.g. Little Gothic BDSM, Metroidvania, or the Palliative Numinous, etc. While some are given here in abridged form, Paratextual Gothic Documents provides all neologisms in full. So, the portions that we'll be reading are concerning state vampirism, disclaimers, both of which are relatively short, a word of warning from a white woman's perspective, ill omens and facing them, Ari the Terminator and police states, and concerning privilege and oppression while seeking intersectional solidarity, Renee as white victim versus non-white victims, and tokenism. The rest of this, the essay body, while it includes changes, we'll not be reading that again, and we won't be reading the conclusion or the footnotes. Speaking of footnotes, though, there is one I'd like you to be aware of ahead of time. As I define it from paratextual documents, Ludogothic BDSM, or rape play. My 2023 combining of an older academic term, ludic Gothic video games, with sex-positive BDSM theatrics as a potent means of camp, specifically rape play by placing rape in quotes mid-Gothic, or rape and playing with it is ubiquitous. The emphasis is less about how video games can be Gothic, and more how the playfulness in video games is commonly used to allow players to camp canon in and out of video games as a form of negotiated power exchange established in playful, game-like forms, theater, and rules, commonly gleaned through Metroidvania as I envision it, or frankly performed with any kind of Gothic poetics. Ludogothic BDSM playfully attains what I call the palliative numinous, or the Gothic quest for self-destructive power is something to camp. The numinous, per Rudolf Otto, being a divine force or numen, tied less to the natural world, the sublime, and more to civilization as derelict, dead, and alien, re, the mysterium tremendum. A communist numinous, the Medusa per Barbara Creed, but also not tokenized, re, the Amazon, while dancing with Hogel's Ghost of the Counterfeit to reverse abjection, thus profit and shrink the state. Keeping that term in mind, this essay, including its different addendums, concerns police brutality and the panic that sets in, survival mechanisms at play when brutality expands. Cops defend property with impunity through might makes right, the law on their side insofar as they are the law. They defend the state's right to rape workers, doing so through intersections of class, culture, and race. An intersectional problem with modules of oppression, therefore perspectives of oppression that divide or combine as needed. I mid objection. Listed forbidding a crossing of different boundaries it prescribes, meaning in stolen language that workers must reclaim, despite their differences. Throughout The Wolf is Loose, then, I supply different viewpoints concerning the receiving of state force as something to witness, and not just directly, but as terror weapon, after the fact. A martyring, classically a lesson for the others, who are then forced to look upon a corpse publicly displayed, which videos are, specifically Ross's video. Viewer and victim become one and the same. This includes white women alongside people of color and other minorities, whose aforementioned viewpoints I provide, while focusing on good, the centerpiece. The fact remains, capital and fascism are an intersectional problem, thus require intersectional solutions to dialectically, materially parse and solve. Intersectional consciousness, awareness, and solidarity, teamwork, generally through artwork as labor-giving perspective, hence why I'm holistically supplying these different viewpoints at all, to make us more aware and intelligent as a would-be team versus capital of the state and fascism as a rising threat dividing all peoples. It's not just about race, but race intersecting with these other variables I just mentioned, a parallel to other scholars doing their own work, e.g. Kian Aspinall and John the Duncans, the hidden roots of neoliberal fascism, race, gender, and the intensification of neoliberal hegemony. Capital decays, the cops invade empire to terrorize everyone inside, feed on them to maintain empire at worker expense, white or otherwise. Intersectional consciousness, a neologism I coined, one meant to combat various forms of reductionism, class, culture, and race, by building on Marx's notion of class consciousness, combining class with culture and race consciousness awareness to raise emotional Gothic intelligence while synthesizing praxis. We'll give several disclaimers, then start with the devil you know. From my perspective as a white trans woman, seeing another white woman killed in the streets in ways not dissimilar to the horror media we so often consume, the shoe suddenly on the other foot. The Western world is generally a place that testifies to its own traumas by fabricating them, as markers of sovereignty that remain historically unkind to specific groups that nevertheless survive within them as ghosts of unspeakable events linked to systemic abuse. Fear is commonly a weapon used against white women to rape their minds, who experience physical and sexual violence domestically versus out in the streets, but it is present in ways that diametrically invert for those on the flip side of the coin. We want to marry the two. So after offering a word of warning to readers from my perspective, that of white women responding to this crisis, I want to remind people to remember the other victims killed by state power other than white women, and to consider their perspectives too. We're all in the same boat, the same prison-like structure housing us differently. The last thing we want to do is tokenize, dividing ourselves into the very gangs the elite use to control us, and generally through relatively small differences. We want to unite, which requires understanding each other's differing perspectives being semi-alien, to find similarity, common ground, amid difference, which intersectional consciousness amounts to, i.e., intersecting sight, not tunnel vision. Tactical unity is key to our survival as a species. Those who betray the cause classically saved for last. Concerning state vampirism. This essay is part of a larger series on state vampirism. As I conceive it, state vampirism equals feeding through the state mid-objection, be it openly capitalist or Marxist-Leninist. These are largely questions of aesthetic, whose Promethean self-destructive function extends to other configurations of omolus, e.g. Zionism. Furthermore, there's overlap between my anti-Zionist work and my work critiquing Marxist-Leninism, state vampirism alongside capital, so consider reading both. Regarding objection, which state predation and revolutionary action both rely on to function, i.e., on the aegis, as something to further or reverse mid-vampirism through paid-unpaid labor, re me vis-a-vis Julia Kristeva. To that objection, us versus them, alienation, and fetishization, is one of four main Gothic theories my book series utilizes, the other three being hauntology, retrofuture, cryptonomy, show, hide, and chronotopes, time-space, alongside smaller theories, e.g. Gerald Hogel's Ghost of the Counterfeit, and Barbara Creed's Monstrous Feminine, Gorgons and Amazonamachia, as I study it. As a queer sex worker and academic, I dialectically materially prioritize objection and vampirism through unpaid labor, chiefly sex work exploited by Cartesian dualism and its harmful maximalist binaries under capitalist realism, but mention the other theories too. Access four main Gothic theories, the four Gs, and paratextual documents for their longer definitions. Disclaimers. This write-up is part of my Sex Positivity book series, which continues after its June 2025 finale and small-form content, e.g. essays on and interviews with other sex workers, all of whom I credit on my acknowledgements pages and sex work page. This essay doesn't focus on sex work itself, but widespread exploitation, i.e. in a shared predatory system, whoring labor out. For the visually impaired, I read this essay on my YouTube channel. Disclaimer regarding essay content. All opinions are my own, i.e. as part of my research, conducted alongside my book series, Gothic Communism. The material within is written, speaks about public figures in popular media for purposes of sex education, satire, transformation, and critique, hence falls under fair use regarding copyright and free speech regarding defamation, obscenity laws. Click here for my entire series disclaimer. Lastly, many of the links on this page lead to my age-gated 18 and up website where my entire work on Gothic Communism is stored and exhibited. Content warning: racism, genocide, and fascism, murder, rape, and tokenism, vampirism, the Gothic, monsters and themes, e.g. werewolves, dragons, and cannibalism, one censored artistic nude. Rape meaning, from my definition, to disempower someone or somewhere, a person, culture, or place, in order to harm them, generally through fetishizing and alienizing acts or circumstances, socio-material conditions that target the mind, body, and or spirit. Rape can be of the mind, spirit, body, and or culture, the land or things tied to it during genocide, etc. It can be individual and or on a mass scale. A word of warning. From a white woman's perspective, ill omens in facing them, re. the Terminator and police states. Under a police state, abuse is everywhere, but affects different parties differently. Reflecting on Good's death, I feel troubled in ways an oracle might. The future, once so clear to me, had now become like a dark highway at night. We were in uncharted territory now, making up history as we went along. This isn't to supersede other victims and their perspectives, simply to give mine from my point of view, ergo privilege and oppression, re. as a white middle-class trans woman, one who studies Gothic media concerning police brutality against all peoples. The fact remains, stories are how we make sense of violence as a structure, a castle for all intents and purposes, but one we're inside of, or at least in its shadow, that returns out of a fearsome imaginary past, bringing hell home to roost, aka military urbanism. Rape is paradoxically something to reenact through stories, making sense of it in ways we play with to learn from. During Little Gothic BDSM, Not everyone has the privilege to consume within a middle-class market with written language, but the ability to tell ghost stories orally has been around since the dawn of time. To it, and from my perspective as a white middle-class trans woman, you hear stories about the fearsome faraway past all the time, e.g. movies like The Terminator calming yourselves, i.e. through rape fantasies, meaning those of unequal power where control is seemingly absent, calculated risk, tied to home as alien, a common phobia for middle-class women. Then and now, insofar as white women, while relatively privileged in lieu of racist structures, the Enlightenment, are kept within nuclear models that routinely see them brutalized through domestic violence, e.g. murder and rape, cops ignoring married women to favor their husbands raping them, the crux of many a Gothic plight. By comparison, cops brutalize people of color out in the open. Violence occurs for both, but distributes differently in different areas of violence, e.g. black men generally don't experience sexism the way that white women do, though can be chattelized called fetishizing names like boy and buck, and white women don't experience police violence the way that black men do, though domestic abuse commonly translates to gun violence comparable to open gang-like forms, wars over territory and property, which women classically are. Both are oppressed in ways we don't want to rank, but acknowledge, through different degrees and flavors. Rape is rape. Racial violence and domestic violence not inherently greater than each other, but two sides of the same coin that exist paradoxically in a shared world, trying to divide them, re. police brutality. We're stronger together than we are divided, and if anyone tells you otherwise, they're probably throwing someone under the bus. Though here, it's more a roadmap to calm our nerves and provide guidance, which an oracle classically does. A police state is no joke, something that comes back around, ostensibly out from older times, a found document, and all to appear nightmarishly in stories, alluding gothically to present-day problems, i.e., the liminal hauntology of war, danger disco, another term of mine when describing a half-real poetic space to heroically move through, on stage and off, and one that concerns the hauntological presence and function of a Gothic chronotope, the castle or some other warlike alien double of the nuclear home, i.e. of the imperial boomerang bringing monsters and their masters home to roost during fascism. To that, I wish to give further words of warning to preface our essay with an opening premise and extended quote from past research I've produced, based on said research but also my personal preference for Gothic stories about damsels in distress, i.e. the seemingly powerless kind facing state machinery threatening ubiquitous rape as omnipresent yet obscure, which a Black Knight, giant suit of armor, basically is. The example I want to provide speaks upon reflection to Good's death and what it portends, re. the Terminator and all it implies, having now tragically come to light. Doing so here is a controlled environment, explained by me in ways we can play with during Little Gothic BDSM to make sense of things together after Good's death, specifically Cameron's infernal love triangle, one where heroine, hero, and imposter reach all too late from a numinous, seemingly imaginary past, re. the ghost of the counterfeit. If only. That story had no happy ending to celebrate, neither does ours, and it's only just beginning. A capitalist nightmare whose apocalypse sees ordinary middle-class white women, the core Gothic readership from the late 1790s onwards, horrifyingly marked for, put to death, in places they're not normally killed. One the dashing hero from the past future cannot stop, and all without Sarah Connor's savior-martyr complex. Regarding imposters, what Cynthia Wolfe would call the demon lover, vis-a-vis Anne Radcliffe, but I digress. Fantasies of mutilative desire that, oddly enough, deal in confronting buried present realities dressed up as past, mid-abjection, re. the ghost of the counterfeit. Things to conjure fearfully up like werewolves, then vanish just as quickly once the black veil is pulled aside, all turning a buck, of course. Except in this case, there is a monster behind the shroud. The police state and its endless pimp-like supply of aforementioned wolves, a black castle in Gothic parlance. Everything is code, abstracting state violence into communicable forms, i.e. ones relatively safe to display under despotic conditions, mere stories mid-cryptonomy, re. to show and hide at once, see Volume 1's Introducing Revolutionary Cryptonomy, and Healing from Rape to consider cryptonomy vis-a-vis the Terminator franchise. The ghost of the counterfeit, as Hogel writes, in the Gothic from the later 18th century on, as David Punter has shown, the middle class often does what we have just seen Leroux do in Le Fantôme. It displaces the hidden violence of present social structures, conjures them up again as past, and falls promptly under their spell, with feelings of both fear and attraction towards the phantasms of what is displaced. Now, the fantasies from Cameron's 1984 and centuries back to Radcliffe's Britain rear their ugly head once more, i.e. inside the same dying American empire, drawing closer to death as capital routinely enters crisis towards final decay. State shift, commonly expressed as climate change, but that is a topic I've discussed elsewhere at length. To that, and despite my initial assumptions about Good, she was not there playing the hero. Her wife was recording ICE on her phone, but Good was merely driving her car away from her own house, i.e. when she was shot, by home invaders recolonizing stolen land, teaching the surviving widow, formerly married to a widow, a brutal lesson. Nicole Good was not an activist, getting Nixon rights, summing things up above. She was not trying to change anything, challenge anyone, or make a statement. She simply wanted to leave the driveway of her home and live her everyday life. She did not enter a conflict. The conflict came to her. Sound familiar? It's basically the plot to a horror movie, one awfully similar to Cameron's Doomsday and Police State it warned about decades before Good was killed. On screen, Sarah lives to seize the day and overcome a seemingly impossible foe. In our world, Sarah is martyred too quick to blink, the hero nowhere in sight. That's what ICE are, a conflict absent of obvious heroes, specifically a manufactured one that blinks into existence, i.e. a police state, one tied to AI no less, and producing its own kind of Terminators. Like Terminators, the cops who kill Good lack pity, fear, or remorse, and a terrible spontaneous show of force to let the locals know who's in charge. They killed Good, a white middle-class woman who might normally seem immune to such violence, in cold blood, again with no hero to save her. Then they released the evidence, whereupon J.D. Vance declared her killer immune, and she the terrorist. Hence these words of warning about police states building on Cameron after Good's ignominious death. If state prosecution lets Vance decree stand, and in a manner similar to the democratic socialists of the Weimar Republic, then Good is just the initiation, not of the already lengthy series of non-white martyrs predating Good, but an escalation extending to Americans of all stripes. In turn, these robotic bulls on parade paid poorly for all peoples, foreign and domestic, i.e. an acceleration of fascism, which is bad for everyone. Like Cameron's Skynet, the only way to survive is by coming together and pushing back, i.e. against the panopticon before it turns on. Originally a medieval tower observing lepers, but described by Foucault as constant surveillance under prison-like conditions. I repeat, hiding is a death trap because the police state, once activated, will hunt everyone down. A one-day pattern killer dressed up as human, but lacking mid-cryptonomy any actual humanity. Proud Boys stand down and stand by. Regarding the lengthy series of non-white martyrs, martyr equals victim, with Good being the first American white woman targeted, the many being brown immigrants, not African Americans. And yes, anger can be useful provided it actually leads people to unify against capital, meaning in ways that challenge the status quo, not waste energy by lashing out at potential allies we can't afford to waste. I get why it happens, but pointing the finger alone doesn't cut it, and time is short, e.g. African Americans declaring after Renee Good was shot, white people made slavery, while conveniently ignoring that white abolitionists do exist and black people can and have tokenized repeatedly throughout history. See footnotes. We gotta be constructive, holding each other accountable while recognizing white power structures, making people white through function, but whose actors consist of any gender and race under the sun, betraying their class interests, and those of other workers they have more in common with than the ruling class, by turning a blind eye. The panopticon was a prison, the blind eye a cell within said prison, one that extends inwards and outwards to the mind, the body, and the spirit, but also the people, their labor, and the land being policed. Segregation is no defense. Unity and clear vision are, surveilling our foes, a means of defending against them, by discouraging open violence by otherwise secret police forces. To that, Trump's machine men are merely awaiting instructions, specifically for state governance and police, to betray the people. Defense network computers. New, powerful, hooked into everything, trusted to run it all. They say it got smart, a new order of intelligence. Then it saw all people as a threat, not just the ones on the other side. decided our fate in a microsecond. Extermination. That's what this is, a command prompt for the federal machine to activate the brown shirts we currently see patrolling the streets ominously like tanks, merely the spear's head to the SS, Gestapo, and death squads of future more efficient killer infiltrators, i.e. under the skin, but hidden in plain sight during military urbanism. Patrol machines built in automated factories, as Cal Reese might put it, routing survivors into camps for orderly disposal. The settler colony extermination device turned on the colonist, specifically their descendants. He would add, the 600 series had rubber skin. We spotted them easy. But these are new. They look human. This would not only mirror in Cameron's sequel, which borrowed uncannily from real life, but in my own writings on the franchise, one describing where we currently are post-mortem, Ari, from the Praxis volume. As a genocidal structure, then, America, the West, and Cartesian dualism were intentionally built around manufactured scarcity and conflict. Fascism is the decay of said structure, one where perceived shortages, as much as actual ones, become terminal, i.e. by arguing for a glorious return to the status quo through force, reinstalling a false time of plenty for the privileged group, not enough work for this group, not enough women, enough space, etc. It must be enforced, generally by a Grim Reaper, come to collect. Regardless, the normalized gaslit presence of the Grim Reaper, as something attached to stochastic violence and state violence, remain an incredibly ill omen. Blind force, collective punishment and genocide personified by canonical executioners, but also automated, worshipped, feared by those who look upon them. Forget if or when. The harvest and its reapers are already here, hiding and feeding in plain sight. Pity those with a place at the table. Exhibit 83B, Cops and Victims. The Terminator franchise is a post-human, hyper-real example of Foucault's boomerang, where the image of the state enforcer has become alive with no actual human behind it. Hugging it equals death, because death is what the state fears and worships, i.e. through its own infiltrators acting replacement out in bad faith, re. Darvo and obscurantism. With this Promethean iteration of the technological singularity in effect, the machine image, specifically in T2, can shapeshift into any surface-level image, what it touches. It is the maniac cop that rapes and murders its victims without any understanding of their feelings at all. It has no feelings. This stems from James Cameron's own poetics. From her 2010 book, The Futurist, The Life and Films of James Cameron, Rebecca Keegan writes, during the writing process, he was in his living room, excitedly explaining the T-1000 to his friend and collaborator Stan Winston, when Winston raised a concern. I don't know who the bad guy is, Winston said. I need a specific character, a specific image. I've got it, Cameron said. He's a cop. The form of the T-1000, which for most of the movie was a Los Angeles police officer. This solved the storytelling dilemma Winston had raised, and also gave Cameron an opportunity to underline a central theme in both of the Terminator movies, how people, especially those in violent jobs, like soldiers and cops, can become barbarized. The Terminator films are not really about the human race getting killed off by future machines. They're about us losing touch with our own humanity and becoming machines, which allows us to kill and brutalize each other, he says. Cops think all non-cops as less than they are, stupid, weak, and evil. They dehumanize the people they are sworn to protect and desensitize themselves in order to do that job. Cameron's selection of a cop also makes sense within his home, the LAPD being recognized for decades as a corrupt police force that terrorizes its own populations, especially minorities. They do this by mirroring and confusing policing language during the cryptonomy process to attack the alien. Ari, from hugging the alien, Exhibit 33B2B. There's far too many analogs for the alien as something to squeeze, but here's several fun ones to help you acclimate to the abjection process. The presence of death, decay, and disintegration linked to an unheimlich, often a buried guilt, secret shame, or some such trauma as imposter overspilling generationally to overwhelm the present moment as trapped inside the home as alien. To this, the T-1000 is blind pastiche, a chimeric embodiment of the Hydra-esque Reaper grimly performing its harvest. This includes interrogating Sarah by unnecessarily torturing and raping her, rape being about power abuse and violence, not love and physical sex, and without understanding why, a sadistic glitch in its code that emulates the glitchy robot brains of real cops, intimidating suspects, taken from an internalized database of disguises, good cop, bad cop. That's all it does. All of this happens according through a Darvo trick. The badge is good, anything else is bad if the wearer kills what it sees as bad. In this sense, it's the perfect simulacrum of the man with no eyes, which historically would have been class traitors wearing one-day mirrors over their eyes to grant them a blinding surveillance and terrifying camera stare to freeze their victims with. The tragedy of this recon, seek and destroy persona is that it evolves through the state's monopoly on violence and desire to protect itself. To do so, it will widen the net of the state of exception, but also upgrade its hunters to genocidal extremes. In the first Terminator film, the HK police lights mirror the red and blue lights of sleek 1984 American cruisers, both being a material, phenomenological extension of America itself as the police state. Taken to its logical conclusion is capitalism run amok, colonizing and replicating everything in service of the state, all to preserve itself from revolutionaries bent on wiping out its existence, including victimized sex workers, sexualized workers, women, minorities, etc., defending themselves from more privileged workers. The robot killer from the future is a death omen, the inhuman ghostly will of vertical power and state tyrant come home. As we'll see deeper in, the solution to fascism lies not with the state, which is venal, cowardly, and corrupt, programmed to self-destruct, but with its people living in the ruins of empire, and not just white Amazonian saviors for straight guys to fetishize. It's silly and serious, if only to reflect how fucked up things are. There's room for power fantasies, yes, but only if they recognize and instill solidarity among a polity of victims, i.e., with diverging levels of privilege, oppression, and betrayal, and whose tokenization we collectively avoid by setting our differences aside, doing so to overcome a common foe. The goblins and their wolf-like wargs are upon us. To that, it can be useful to understand the white, female, middle-class perspective, because it showcases the reality of what it's like to live in a domestic sphere invaded by bad actors brutalizing labor for the state. A restraining order is just a piece of paper, i.e., says the housewife when the stalker wants inside. So is the Constitution, and so says anyone being stalked by the state. Cops are stalkers who want the right to stalk unsurveilled, whereupon they can watch us, but we can't watch them save with our God-given eyes, which can be threatened. Dead men tell no tales, but cameras can be intimidated once the data is out there. It becomes a game of triage. To let I dare wait upon I would, while people's survival mechanisms short-circuit, i.e. tunnel vision and blinders becoming a question of survival when the chickens come home to roost. This brings us to an ongoing proposition of visual calculus, including different vantage points to give us the necessary sight, i.e. to see through state illusions, the fascist fog of war, from a white woman's privileged perspective, to those with less privilege, different oppression, essentially in the same boat. Note, the following section is my attempt to critically engage with and include non-white perspectives, i.e. while preaching intersectionality as a means of shared praxis holding each other accountable. My doing so is imperfect. For one, insofar as no perfect victims exist, has no perfect revolutionaries punching up. The same goes for anyone, intersectional solidarity occurring through critical engagement, i.e. while listening to the oppressed during a collective pedagogy thereof. In keeping with Paulo Freire's 1968 book, I strongly encourage engaging with oppressed perspectives, the ones included here merely a taste, i.e. of a much larger selection in a larger conversation. The others have also added to, e.g. Elliot Sangagan's Black folks have been warning us. Concerning privilege and oppression, while seeking intersectional solidarity, Renee Good as white victim versus non-white victims and tokenism. For a white girl, rape or fear of rape is generally ubiquitous, but gun violence, meaning from someone other than a father, boyfriend, or husband, notably less common out of doors. For black people, but especially black men, it's pretty much Tuesday. To it, while our focus here remains on Good, she is also a victim of relative privilege, with some oppression, re as a lesbian widow. While standing up for Good's murder, martyring by state powers, we must also acknowledge and voice solidarity with, remembrance for others less fortunate oppressed to different degrees and flavors, i.e. of relative oppression, those killed by ICE who won't receive the same kind of Christ-like attention, e.g. Keith Porter, a black man shot by ICE 7 days before Good was killed, and Silverio Villegas Gonzalez, killed by ICE on September 12th after dropping his kids off at school. A pedagogy of the oppressed recognizes ratios of privilege oppression while seeking intersectional solidarity mid-crisis. So while an absence of material conditions renders crisis invisible, and white middle-class people are where the spotlight tends to shine, we must take the time to recognize who we're standing against fascism with, our fellow oppressed, many kettled to different degrees and flavors of reactive abuse than ourselves. E.g., I'm a trans woman during trans genocide, but I'm still white, male, middle class, and pass. Renee herself is something of a poster victim too, being a middle class white woman with white privilege and class privilege, despite the abuses faced by privileged women, queer or otherwise, rape first and foremost, but other forms of female violence too, e.g., compelled pregnancies, rape or otherwise, and nadir-level mortality rates for the mother, medical, psychiatric abuse, the pay gap, etc. Chief among them is murder or murder-suicide, i.e. by a male abuser with a knife or gun against a female victim, not only incredibly common, but what happened too good. Jonathan Ross calling her a fucking bitch after murdering her with his gun, shooting her in the face multiple times. It's domestic abuse, which white people can relate to. Except the current violence we're seeing against people like Renee, meaning those closer to the in-group, at long-lasting Jameson's class nightmare come to pass, have been escalating previously for months, years, decades, and centuries against those capital and its benefactors historically suppress and ignore, e.g., token white women turning a blind eye, i.e. in favor of white women materially and socially having some degree of privilege over other victims of capital, re. race, gender, and often class. It's possible then to be a rape victim and still have privilege. See every Gothic heroine ever, e.g. Ellen Ripley below. What can gentrify can decay. Regarding Jameson's class nightmare, i.e. masked gunmen working for a rogue state versus the usual benefactors, highway bandits pilfering the middle class, classically relatively privileged white women clutching at pearls. They'll threaten white women to tokenize them, killing one woman pimp style as a martyr-like lesson. Don't make a bad decision. The cops say this, as do critics responding unempathetically to Good's martyring. These conversations, in turn, frequently lead to blows, battles not just over land, but worker hearts and minds tied to land, labor, and sex, subject to state force. Except debates had between friends also include scholars from all different walks. A.J. Jameson's boring and exhausted paradigm comment disparaging Gothic in ways that I, a scholar of the Gothic and activist myself, actively disliked. R.A. from Volume 1's preface, Gothic Gay Anarcho-Communism. Fred Botting and Frederick Jameson are apologists of science fiction as somehow not Gothic. R.E. Botting's silly arguments of Gothic redundancy as I tackle them, and Jameson's very dumb 1991 declaration in postmodernism calling the Gothic that boring and exhausted paradigm. The quote is ubiquitous, but consider the opening page for Alex Link's The Mysteries of Postmodernism, or Frederick Jameson's Gothic Plots, for a summary of it. In the midst of its definitive arguments, Frederick Jameson's postmodernism, or the cultural logic of late capitalism, pauses to consider the Gothic just long enough to single it out as a hopelessly boring and exhausted paradigm. The Gothic, he declares, is a mere class fantasy or nightmare in which the dialectic of privilege and shelter is exercised, and it should not be mistaken for a proto-feminist denunciation of patriarchy nor a proto-political protest against rape. Let me re-find my spot here. And yes, I know that sexism and queerphobia are as old as civilization, and that white women who betray their assigned owners will be treated like whores and martyred by vengeful pimp-like men. But the current orderings of state power still prioritize preferential mistreatment mid-abuse in ways that categorically favor middle-class, queer-normative, aka passing white women, coverage-wise, versus racialized and or overtly queer violence, i.e. said women, given the spotlight, sucking up coverage regarding domestic abuse is only discussed for certain women, with older forms of feminism historically fascist making exclusionary struggles that benefit the status quo is white, straight, and male, e.g. TERFs and SWERFs acting white, straight, and male, being my initial study group as a specialist in tokenism. RE, regarding tokenism and fighting it. All lives matter when challenging police violence, of course, but the problem and solution remain intersectional. RE, when regarding how capital affects different lives differently relative to each other's privilege oppression, i.e. as something the state feeds on, through as a vector of sight mid-decay, one Holocaust victim betraying the others for a few seconds longer before they're eaten above. Such is abjection, which reverses only when parsing the painful realities said feeding devices extract over time. That non-white lives systemically face racial violence in ways white lives do not. Queer lives face gendered violence in ways that straight lives do not. Unpaid labor, e.g. sex work, faces material violence, paid labor does not. Female GNC folk face sexist violence, male straight lives do not. The Global South faces territorial violence, the North does not, and so on. In fact, those who experience harm generally do so at the hands of those who don't, even if that means to willful ignorance from the privileged parties, including those who tokenize to betray their allies' shared struggle in different ways. Privilege equals punching down as much as it does material conditions, i.e. the ability to punch down, then act upon it despite generational trauma, racial, gendered, etc. Assimilation is poor stewardship, an inability to learn from past betrayals that workers must avoid, i.e. by banding together despite not always wanting to, a struggle of tactical unity when facing tough choices. Note, some compare ICE to American slavers, slave catchers, versus the Gestapo. I would caution against seeing these as separate, given the Nazis were slavers emulating Americans. Furthermore, despite a race impetus under fascism, it is also guided by parallel bigotries affecting other minorities during their own simultaneous genocides, e.g. trans people, sex workers, and indigenous parties. It's not just about race, but race intersecting with other qualities that invite racial violence regardless of ethnicity. To punch up is to be treated as non-white, and to be non-white is to be likewise treated as queer, and so on. These are modules of oppression that unto themselves commonly intersect and have similar outcomes, namely police brutality. Lastly, such modules intersect in ways that efface those closer to the margins, i.e. during token violence, compound minorities rendered alien inside their own communities, by their own communities, or by other communities in the same boat monopolizing oppression, i.e. ranking rape, e.g. queer and or female POCs experiencing intra-racial sexism and homophobia from token actors, or said POCs devaluing interracial minorities with similar oppression elsewhere, with some darker-skinned African Americans tokenizing to exclude non-white, non-American people with lighter skin, not just those in their own communities. This includes attacking my partner and co-writer Bay Ryan, Bay being Irish, Mali, disabled and queer above, and experiencing shadism from American POCs monopolizing blackness, and who sometimes also view black people, spelled with a K, different from non-white, as not black or not oppressed too, an alternate spelling of black. Australia's Indigenous, Aboriginal, and Torres Strait Islander peoples have long identified with the term black, more specifically as BLAK, or blackfellas. Source Christina Varan's Black Lives Matter, Indigenous Australia's Solidarity with the U.S. Movement for Black Lives, 2020. Furthermore, such betrayals generally happen with the very platforms African Americans speak from, using them to exclude color as identity versus a visual marker of race, i.e. in ways that overlook racial violence not tied to skin color alone, e.g. the English genocided the Irish, who also had white skin. Unlike previous invaders, the authors write, these British Protestants regarded the Catholic Irish as racially inferior. The newcomers rarely intermarried with the locals. In 1649, when Oliver Cromwell's forces arrived in Ireland, the result was a brutal genocidal campaign. Source Livia Gershon's Britain's Blueprint for Colonialism, Made in Ireland, 2020. Whatever the case, lionizing a particular kind of racial manifestation, meaning like it makes one group more special than other victims, only makes that group blind, a de facto cop or aider of cops. To that, black people can be racist too, are being racist when saying, this isn't our fight concerning Renee Good. No offense, but it's going to become your fight when ICE prioritizes non-white people first, and already is. If you ignore fascism, fascism kills you. The fact remains, racism is ultimately a system of exclusion upheld by selective opportunistic tokenism, undermining solidarity, with oppression often being reductively tied to skin color, to center state relief around equality and nothing else, e.g. despite how many non-white people with fair skin also experience racism in Australia, New Zealand, and the surrounding islands, i.e. token African Americans excluding non-American POCs and non-white persons from liberation efforts, or ignoring the genocide in Palestine or elsewhere, e.g. Sudan. To exclude is to reduce, often prioritizing one group as center of something while excluding others in the bargain, a Faustian bargain, e.g. Afrocentrism, RE from the poetry module. Dress it up however you want then, but class and race betrayal are class and race betrayal ipso facto. Flow of power determines function. We're talking about Afronormativity per Afrocentrism being used as a tokenized rotting mask pushing power towards the state, but it applies to any in-community policing by tokenized agents that, while they have legitimate grievances, choose to kiss up to state power and punch laterally against their own kind/comrades, or down depending on their privilege. I experience as much discrimination by cis to GNC AFAB sex workers excluding trans misogyny as I do white cishet men, but also from black actors calling me a white theorist as a means of discrediting my work as functionally non-white. I won't condone or defend that, but instead will out and express it as a form of decay that needs to be acknowledged and discussed in response to my work as a group effort, thus grew to protect from class and race traitors, useful idiots serving capital. Tokenism is tokenism, especially if exclusion occurs, the Judas refrain of any normativity policing other minorities above. The same goes for accusations of anti-blackness from other queer people, e.g. when I critiqued several straight black men, said men helping enable a white trans woman, co-workers, liberal Zionism, RE sharing the blame. To solidarize to a fully intersectional degree, we have to unite while holding each other accountable. American or not, black people are racist through exclusion, e.g. token cops being class traitors and race traitors, but especially when alienating people of different countries or identities experiencing their own genocides, diasporas, and or moments of political violence, RE to a martyr-like degree that becomes dogmatic when someone turns a blind eye by reducing others to symbols of state apologia. You're fucked. By comparison, white people can legitimately criticize non-white people for different bigotries, e.g. for non-white racism, provided they aren't bigoted when doing so. Just as slurs aren't activism, neither are bigotry and exclusion as a whole, nor recuperation insofar as BLM leaders compromise their values, i.e. in ways that enrich the leaders by commodifying the movement. It goes both ways, but anisotropically insofar as bigoted, non-bigoted applies differently per case, i.e. depending on who's doing what to whom concerning who has privilege and who doesn't relative to everyone involved, e.g. a straight black man having racial oppression but male privilege vis-a-vis a white trans woman who has racial privilege but male oppression for not being straight, and class being a part of the equation depending on who has money and status and who doesn't. All of these qualities can lead to betrayal or solidarity depending on how people behave, i.e. towards others regarding their oppression too. In short, we're punching up or punching down. Both all at once and across generations, many different factors and players are at play. Good actors and bad, which share language, land bodies, props, costumes, etc. E.g. white actors with non-white bodies, which the policing of said bodies extends to black men towards white women. Art is an extension of ourselves and our rights to exist, self-express, e.g. whores above. Something of a thesis statement, one to take with you into the essay body, so do intersectional problems require intersectional solutions by combining this with that, re intersectional consciousness, dialectically materially merging issues of class, culture, and race through solidarity, teamwork, i.e. while playfully and poetically acknowledging the various historical material inequalities experienced simultaneously by different groups seeking common ground, but often tokenizing to betray each other. Through shared language, e.g. terror and sex, to humanize others harmed by the state to martyr-like degrees is to render them visible beyond simple dogmatic tools, meaning in ways that discourage tokenism mid-synthesis through daily habits that cultivate a means of praxis, therefore accountability. To do that, we must understand how we're all alien, i.e. through different degrees of privilege oppression making us more visible, or less, under shadows of state power run amok, learning from each other's unique experiences, relating to each other through media with target audiences, while banding together as actual audience members. For white people, especially women, that means Gothic stories. For other people, it segues onto other canvases. The example Heather Cox Richardson gives in It's Time to Talk About Fascism, responding to Good's martyring by the state, is Uncle Tom's Cabin. But really, it could be any piece of media. This includes the stuff workers make ourselves, but also friends we've never met, and faraway places we've never been to, above. Meaning for workers different than the author to see and imperfectly relate to, back and forth. Doing so happens not as enemies with variable degrees and flavors of privilege oppression, but as allies, i.e. those with relative privilege, a position that non-token white women commonly fill alongside other marginalities, seeking to find common ground with the less privileged, and doing so during shared struggle, highlighting our relative privilege and oppression, ergo betrayals. Is it messy and unequal? Sure, but so is life. The point is to drive towards equality from unequal positions, not to tokenize and discard the value of each other's lives mid-objection. What harms those with privilege harms those without, making the prevention of state overreach a priority for all while reversing objection to ourselves. As targets of state violence, sharing the language of persecution, rebelling with said language in different ways, is something to wear and camp/perform violence, terror, and monsters with, essentially communicating alienation and fetishization as something to reclaim from our abusers. Below. Whether the lady and the tramp or the pauper and the prince of any class, gender, and race combination, we all experience hell differently, insofar as it's both a positive and negative phenomenon. One canon relegates theatrically to zones of unholy play that, count by iconoclasts liberating all workers, concern harm but also fatal attraction, forbidden love as rebellion. If the above examples show, anyone can be a rebel, potential to actual martyr, if only for others to rally behind while pushing towards universal liberation, thus preventing martyrdom in the process, and having different disagreements about, see footnotes, through what was lost and found again inside Omelis. Intersectionality is a weapon because empathy is a weapon which intersectionality encourages, i.e., if cruelty is the point, then empathy is the counterpoint. Knowledge is power integrating empathetically into intersectional action mid-consciousness. To that, intersectionality matters because fascism has always been international, a dying empire feeding desperately on everything in sight to preserve itself. It's extant, as are racism, sexism, etc., and their persecutorial accompaniment. To avoid blind panic and outrage ourselves, we, meaning all workers, white or not, should look to solidarity mid oppression in all its forms, i.e., past or present, local or distant, borrowing this from that in any direction, a vital, powerful ability to reflect on our own place in things, whoever we are, is tied to larger ongoing issues. That's all we have time for here. Keep all of this in mind as we examine Good herself, then talk about camping rape, which martyrdom essentially is, towards the end, and refer to rock stars, from rock and roll fans, and Jimi Hendrix's penis to horror movie special effects, if you want even more interracial examples. That includes me reading some of the addendums and footnotes of this essay with the hopes to foster intersectional consciousness and solidarity, awareness, and teamwork. It's a work in progress. There are some spelling mistakes, and I will continue modifying it as time goes on. However, this is its current version. If you liked what I read, here's a little bit more information about me specifically. My name's Persephone Vanderwaard. I have my MA in Gothic English Literature, an independent PhD in Gothic Poetics and Little Gothic BDSM, focusing partially on Metroidvania, and I am the author of the multi-volume, non-profit book series, Sex Positivity versus Sex Coercion or Gothic Communism. Its art director, sole invigilator, illustrator, and primary editor, the other co-writer, co-editor being May Ryan, a rape survivor, granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor and Dutch resistance member, and someone anti-war as a business, anti-Zionist and anti-racist, anti-white supremacist who specializes in tokenism, e.g. TERFs, SWERFs, and fascist feminism. I'm a male-to-female trans woman, Tolkien and Amazon enthusiast, anti-fascist, loud critic of Marxist-Leninism, state vampirism, atheist and Satanist, polypan kinkster with multiple partners, erotic artist, pornographer, and anarcho-communist, i.e., under my brand of Gothic gay anarcho-communism as a holistic intersectional discipline, one devised in 2022-2023, in which my friends and I currently achieve together. Originally, this blog explored my love of movies when I was cishet. Now, I use it to write about the Gothic, horror, but also sex, heavy metal, and video games in a queer way, especially Metroidvania. You can financially support my blog through Ko-fi or Patreon. One is safe for work, and the other not safe for work, but the money for either goes towards the same art and essays I produce, which often complement each other. Regarding formatting issues for blog posts older than October 2025, recently Josie Howarth helped transfer my old blog from Blogger to WordPress, which, while vital for security reasons, altered their formatting. On a phone screen, the posts are mostly readable, but look slightly jank on computer screens. Many also contain outdated About the Author sections, meaning inside the posts in question, alongside the blog website footer as added by Josie after the transfer. Such things are temporary. Eventually, we plan to overhaul their visual design, remodeling my blog and website, thus fixing the issues in question. Thank you for listening, and stay safe out there. Fight back in ways that won't get you murdered, hopefully, and remember your rights, protect yourself, your friends, and good luck.